On a crisp February morning in 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower sat in his Lincoln bedroom, carefully reviewing a speech that would fundamentally alter American identity. Outside his window, the Washington Monument pierced a gray sky, while inside, the former general who had defeated Nazi Germany was preparing to sign legislation that would add two words to the Pledge of Allegiance that millions of American children recited daily. Those two words, under God, weren't added because of a religious revival or spiritual awakening. They were added because of fear. Fear of an enemy that threatened not just American territory or American interests, but the very soul of American civilization, godless communism. What happened next represents one of the most remarkable transformations in American history. A nation founded on the separation of church and state, whose constitution deliberately avoided mentioning God, suddenly embraced public religiosity with an intensity that would have shocked the founders. America didn't just become more religious during the Cold War. It became performatively Christian, wrapping itself in the flag and the cross simultaneously to prove its moral superiority over the atheistic Soviet Union. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the hidden forces that reshaped our world. What you're about to discover is how geopolitical competition created a religious identity that still defines American politics today. The Cold War didn't just divide the world into competing ideologies, it forced America to become something it had never been before, a self-consciously Christian nation. Before we dive into this extraordinary story of faith, fear, and geopolitics, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell, because what we're about to reveal will change how you understand both American religion and American foreign policy forever. And I'm genuinely curious about our global community. Drop a comment telling me what time you're watching this and which city you're tuning in from. To understand how dramatically the Cold War changed American religious identity, we need to travel back to the America that existed before the Soviet threat transformed everything. The America of the 1920s and 1930s was a nation where public religiosity was far more muted, where political leaders rarely invoked God in their speeches, and where the idea of America as a specifically Christian nation would have seemed foreign to most citizens. Consider Franklin Roosevelt, who led America through the Great Depression and most of World War II. FDR was personally religious, attended church regularly, and occasionally referenced divine providence in his speeches. But his famous radio addresses, the fireside chats that defined Depression-era America, were notably secular in tone. When Roosevelt spoke about American values, he talked about democracy, freedom, and economic security, not Christianity or divine mission. Even more striking was the original Pledge of Allegiance, written in 1892 by Francis Bellamy, a socialist minister who deliberately excluded any reference to God. For over 60 years, American children recited "One Nation, indivisible with liberty and justice for all," without any mention of divine authority. The pledge was patriotic, but it wasn't religious. This secular approach to public life reflected the founders' careful separation of church and state, but it also reflected practical political realities. America in the early 20th century was becoming increasingly diverse religiously. Catholics, Jews, and Protestant denominations that differed sharply on theological questions all needed to feel included in American public life. Keeping government and public institutions officially neutral on religious questions seemed like the wisest course. But everything began to change in 1917, when the Bolshevik Revolution created the world's first officially atheistic state. Suddenly, America faced an ideological enemy that wasn't just politically different, but religiously threatening. The Soviet Union didn't just oppose American capitalism. It opposed religion itself, declaring faith to be the opium of the people, and systematically persecuting believers. At first, this religious dimension of the communist threat remained relatively minor. During the 1920s and 1930s, most Americans viewed communism primarily as an economic and political challenge rather than a spiritual one. Even during World War II, when America allied with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany, religious differences took a back seat to shared military objectives. The transformation began almost immediately after World War II ended, when wartime allies became Cold War enemies. But the trigger wasn't just geopolitical competition. It was a series of shocking revelations about how communists were actually treating religious believers in countries under Soviet control. In 1946, Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty was arrested and tortured by communist authorities in Hungary. His show trial and forced confession horrified American Catholics and provided vivid evidence of communist persecution of Christians. Similar stories emerged from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other Eastern European countries where communist governments were systematically dismantling churches, arresting priests, and forcing believers to choose between their faith and their freedom. These stories had enormous impact on American public opinion because they weren't abstract geopolitical theories. They were personal testimonies of religious persecution that American believers could easily imagine happening to them. The communist threat suddenly became not just political but existential. These weren't just people who disagreed with American economic policy. They were people who wanted to destroy American faith. The man who understood this dynamic better than anyone else was Billy Graham, the young evangelical preacher who would become perhaps the most influential religious figure in 20th century America. Graham's genius was recognizing that the Cold War had created an unprecedented opportunity to make Christianity central to American national identity. In 1949, Graham was conducting a relatively modest revival in Los Angeles when William Randolph Hearst, the media magnate, sent a telegram to his newspaper editors with two words that would change American religious history: Puff Graham. Suddenly, Graham's revival was front-page news across the country, attracting massive crowds and national attention. But Graham's message wasn't just about personal salvation. It was about national survival. He warned that America faced a choice between Christianity and communism, between God and godlessness, between salvation and slavery. "We are living in a day when we must make a choice," Graham declared. "It is either Christ or chaos, conviction or compromise, discipline or disintegration." Graham's apocalyptic rhetoric resonated powerfully with Americans who were struggling to understand the new world order that had emerged after World War II. Here was a simple explanation for the global conflict. It wasn't just about competing economic systems or spheres of influence. It was about the cosmic battle between good and evil, faith and atheism, God and Satan. The political implications were enormous. If the Cold War was fundamentally a religious conflict, then America's response needed to be religious as well. It wasn't enough to build better weapons or stronger alliances. America needed to demonstrate its spiritual superiority over godless communism. This is where Dwight Eisenhower enters our story. When Eisenhower ran for president in 1952, he was not known as a particularly religious man. He had been raised in a religious household, but rarely attended church as an adult. His military career had been spent in the decidedly secular environment of the professional army. Yet, as president, Eisenhower would become the most publicly religious chief executive in American history up to that point. Eisenhower's transformation wasn't driven by personal religious awakening. It was driven by strategic calculation. He understood that the Cold War was as much about moral legitimacy as military power, and that America needed to demonstrate its spiritual superiority over communist atheism. Making America more explicitly Christian wasn't just good politics, it was good strategy. The changes came quickly and dramatically. In 1953, Eisenhower was baptized as an adult and joined a church for the first time in decades. He began hosting prayer breakfasts at the White House, started cabinet meetings with prayers, and peppered his speeches with religious references. Most importantly, he actively supported legislation to make American public life more explicitly Christian. The addition of "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954 was the most visible symbol of this transformation. Eisenhower signed the legislation on Flag Day, declaring that millions of our school children will daily proclaim, in every city and town, every village and rural schoolhouse, the dedication of our nation and our people to the Almighty. The timing wasn't coincidental. It came just months after Senator Joseph McCarthy had been censured for his anti-communist crusade, and political leaders were looking for new ways to demonstrate American opposition to godless communism. But the pledge was just the beginning. In 1955, Congress mandated that "In God We Trust" appear on all American currency. In 1956, "In God We Trust" became the official national motto, replacing the unofficial "E pluribus unum." Prayer rooms were established in the Capitol building. The words "So help me God" were added to various federal oaths. America was systematically inscribing Christianity into its public institutions in ways that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. These changes weren't just symbolic, they reflected a fundamental shift in how Americans understood their national identity. The Cold War had created a narrative in which America wasn't just another democracy competing with another superpower, but a Christian nation engaged in holy war against atheistic communism. This narrative gave moral weight to American foreign policy and domestic politics that transcended mere national interest. Consider how this religious framing shaped American perceptions of specific Cold War conflicts. The Korean War wasn't just about containing communist expansion. It was about defending Christian civilization against godless aggression. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 wasn't just about national self-determination. It was about religious freedom versus atheistic oppression. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just about nuclear weapons. It was about God versus godlessness in America's backyard. This religious interpretation of the Cold War had profound effects on American domestic politics as well. Politicians who wanted to demonstrate their anti-communist credentials increasingly emphasized their Christian faith. Being authentically American required being authentically Christian, and being authentically Christian required being authentically anti-communist. The National Prayer Breakfast, first held in 1953, became an annual ritual where political leaders from both parties gathered to demonstrate their shared Christian faith and their common opposition to godless communism. These weren't just religious services. They were political performances designed to show the world that America's leaders were people of faith who drew their authority from divine rather than merely human sources. But perhaps the most significant impact of Cold War Christianity was on American evangelicalism itself. Before the Cold War, evangelical Christians had largely withdrawn from political engagement, focusing on personal salvation rather than social transformation. The communist threat changed everything, giving evangelicals a compelling reason to engage politically and providing them with enormous influence over American foreign policy. Billy Graham became the unofficial chaplain of American foreign policy, advising presidents from Truman to Obama and providing religious legitimacy for American military interventions around the world. When America fought communist forces in Vietnam, Graham was there to bless the troops and explain how military action served divine purposes. When America supported anti-communist dictators in Latin America, Graham provided theological justification for alliances with authoritarian regimes. This transformation of American Christianity had ironic consequences that few anticipated at the time. By making Christianity central to anti-communist foreign policy, American leaders inadvertently made American Christianity more political and less spiritual. Faith became a weapon in ideological warfare rather than a source of moral reflection and spiritual growth. The effects were visible in how American Christians began to think about their role in the world. Instead of seeing themselves primarily as disciples of Jesus called to love their enemies and care for the poor, many American Christians began to see themselves as soldiers in a cosmic battle against godless communism. This militarization of American Christianity would have profound consequences for both American religion and American foreign policy. Consider how the religious framing of the Cold War affected American perceptions of the developing world. When nationalist movements emerged in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, American leaders automatically assumed they were communist-inspired because they challenged Western domination. The possibility that these movements might be motivated by legitimate grievances against colonialism or economic exploitation was dismissed because they weren't explicitly Christian. This led to American support for some of the most brutal dictatorships of the 20th century, justified on the grounds that any government was preferable to communist atheism. Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, Augusto Pinochet in Chile, and the Shah of Iran all received American support despite their horrific human rights records because they were seen as bulwarks against godless communism. The religious dimension of the Cold War also shaped how Americans understood domestic dissent. Civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, and labor organizers were often dismissed as communist sympathizers because they challenged existing American institutions. If America was a Christian nation engaged in holy war against atheistic communism, then criticizing American policies was tantamount to supporting the enemy. This created enormous problems for American Christians who took seriously their faith's teachings about justice, peace, and care for the oppressed. When Martin Luther King Jr. opposed the Vietnam War, he was attacked not just for being unpatriotic, but for being un-Christian. When Catholic priests protested American support for Latin American dictatorships, they were accused of communist sympathies. The Cold War had made certain political positions incompatible with authentic Christianity. The irony deepened when American foreign policy began to contradict core Christian teachings about peace, justice, and human dignity. The same country that proclaimed itself Christian was supporting death squads in El Salvador, training torturers in the School of the Americas, and overlooking massive human rights violations by anti-communist allies. The gap between American rhetoric about Christian values and American actions in support of those values became increasingly difficult to ignore. Yet the religious framing of the Cold War proved remarkably resilient, surviving even the most obvious contradictions between Christian principles and American foreign policy. This resilience reflected the deep psychological need that Cold War Christianity met for many Americans. It provided a simple explanation for complex global conflicts and gave moral meaning to American power in ways that purely secular ideologies could not. The election of John F. Kennedy in 1960 presented an interesting test case for Cold War Christianity. Kennedy was Catholic, which troubled many Protestant Americans who worried about papal influence on American foreign policy. But Kennedy's aggressive anti-communism and explicit embrace of American religious identity reassured skeptics that he understood the spiritual dimensions of the Cold War. Kennedy's inaugural address perfectly captured the religious language that had become standard in American political discourse. "Let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth God's work must truly be our own." This wasn't traditional Christian theology. It was Cold War Christianity that made American foreign policy into divine mission. The Vietnam War represented the climax and crisis of Cold War Christianity. Here was the ultimate test of whether American military power could serve Christian purposes and whether American values could be spread through American arms. The massive bombing campaigns, the use of chemical weapons, and the enormous civilian casualties created cognitive dissonance for many American Christians who had been taught that America fought for God against godless communism. The anti-war movement forced many Americans to confront the contradictions between Christian principles and American foreign policy that Cold War Christianity had obscured. When Buddhist monks immolated themselves to protest American-backed South Vietnamese policies, it became difficult to maintain that America was defending religious freedom. When American troops destroyed Vietnamese villages to save them from communism, it became hard to argue that American military action served Christian purposes. But instead of abandoning Cold War Christianity, many American evangelicals doubled down on their support for American military action, arguing that communist victory would bring even greater suffering than American intervention. This position required increasingly sophisticated theological gymnastics to maintain, but it preserved the essential framework that made Christianity central to American national identity. The Reagan presidency marked the revival and transformation of Cold War Christianity after the doubts raised by Vietnam and Watergate. Reagan understood instinctively that Americans wanted to believe again in their nation's religious mission, and he provided the rhetorical framework that made such belief possible despite the obvious contradictions. Reagan's genius was combining traditional Cold War themes about godless communism with new religious language about America as a shining city upon a hill that was divinely chosen to lead the world to freedom. This imagery drew on deep American traditions about national mission while updating them for contemporary geopolitical realities. Reagan's support for anti-communist forces around the world was consistently framed in religious terms. The Contras in Nicaragua weren't just guerrilla fighters, they were freedom fighters, defending Christian civilization against communist atheism. The Mujahideen in Afghanistan weren't just insurgents. They were holy warriors fighting godless Soviet occupation. American military aid wasn't just geopolitical strategy, it was Christian charity helping oppressed believers resist atheistic tyranny. This religious framing allowed Reagan to build enormous political support for American interventions that might otherwise have been controversial. When Americans were told they were supporting fellow believers against atheistic oppression, military aid became a moral imperative rather than a foreign policy choice. But the end of the Cold War created an unexpected crisis for American Christianity. For 40 years, American religious identity had been defined largely in opposition to godless communism. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the communist threat disappeared, American Christians faced a fundamental question. What did it mean to be a Christian nation when there was no longer an atheistic enemy to oppose? The answer revealed how completely the Cold War had transformed American Christianity. Instead of returning to pre-Cold War patterns of religious life, American evangelicals began searching for new enemies that could serve the same function that godless communism had served during the Cold War. The culture wars of the 1990s, the war on terror after 9/11, and contemporary political polarization all represent attempts to recreate the clarity and moral purpose that Cold War Christianity had provided. The legacy of Cold War Christianity continues to shape American politics and religion today in ways that most Americans don't fully recognize. The assumption that America has a special divine mission in the world, the belief that American military power serves Christian purposes, and the conviction that opposition to American foreign policy represents opposition to God Himself, all trace back to the religious transformation that occurred during the Cold War. Contemporary debates about American exceptionalism, military intervention, and the role of religion in public life all reflect the enduring influence of Cold War Christianity. When politicians invoke God's blessing on America, when military chaplains bless American weapons, when American leaders claim divine authority for their policies, they are drawing on a tradition that was created not by the founders or by Christian theology, but by the geopolitical competition of the Cold War. Perhaps most significantly, Cold War Christianity created a form of American religious nationalism that often contradicts core Christian teachings about peace, justice, and universal love. The same Christianity that was supposed to provide moral guidance for American foreign policy became a tool for justifying whatever policies served American interests, regardless of their compatibility with Christian principles. This transformation had profound consequences for American Christianity itself. By making patriotism central to religious faith, Cold War Christianity created a form of civil religion that often overshadowed traditional Christian concerns about spiritual salvation, moral transformation, and social justice. American Christians began to define their faith more by their political loyalties than by their religious convictions. The international implications were equally significant. America's embrace of Cold War Christianity convinced many people around the world that Christianity was simply a tool of American imperialism rather than a universal message of love and redemption. This association between Christianity and American power created obstacles for Christian missionaries and contributed to the decline of Christian influence in many parts of the world. Today, American Christianity continues to grapple with the legacy of the Cold War transformation. Some American Christians have recognized the problems created by identifying their faith too closely with American political interests and have called for a return to more traditional Christian emphases on peace, justice, and universal love. Others have doubled down on Christian nationalism, arguing that America's divine mission requires even more aggressive assertion of American power and values. Understanding this history is crucial for anyone seeking to comprehend contemporary American politics and religion. The religious rhetoric that seems natural to many Americans today, the assumption that God blesses America in special ways, the belief that American military power serves divine purposes, the conviction that American values are universal values, all reflect the specific historical circumstances of the Cold War rather than eternal religious truths. The story of how the Cold War made America pretend to be Christian reveals the enormous power of geopolitical competition to reshape religious identity and the dangerous consequences of subordinating spiritual principles to political objectives. It shows how external threats can transform internal cultures in ways that persist long after the original threats have disappeared. Most importantly, it demonstrates that religious traditions are not immune to political manipulation, and that even sincere believers can be led to embrace positions that contradict their own deepest convictions when those positions are wrapped in the language of religious duty and national mission. As we conclude this exploration of one of the most significant religious transformations in American history, I want to thank you for joining me at Professor Archive. The story of Cold War Christianity reveals how external geopolitical pressures can reshape internal religious and cultural identities in ways that continue to influence society long after the original crisis has passed. This history helps explain why American political discourse remains so heavily influenced by religious language, why American foreign policy continues to be justified in moral and spiritual terms, and why American Christianity often seems more concerned with political power than spiritual transformation. Understanding these Cold War origins doesn't resolve contemporary debates about religion and politics, but it does help us recognize that many of the assumptions we take for granted about American religious identity are actually relatively recent historical developments. The transformation of American Christianity during the Cold War also raises important questions about the relationship between faith and patriotism, between religious conviction and political loyalty, and between spiritual principles and national interests. These questions remain as relevant today as they were during the height of the Cold War, as Americans continue to struggle with how their religious beliefs should influence their political commitments. What's your perspective on this remarkable transformation? Do you see evidence of Cold War Christianity in contemporary American politics and religion? How do you think religious communities should navigate the relationship between faith and patriotism in diverse democratic societies? I'm genuinely interested in your thoughts on these complex questions, so please share them in the comments below. And don't forget to tell me what time you're watching this and which city you're tuning in from. These questions about religion, politics, and national identity resonate across cultures and continents. If this deep dive into the intersection of religion, politics, and geopolitics fascinated you, make sure you're subscribed to Professor Archive and have that notification bell activated. We explore the hidden forces that shape our world, from the grand narratives of international relations to the intimate details of how external pressures transform internal cultures. Every week, we uncover stories that help us understand not just where we've been, but how geopolitical competition continues to shape religious and cultural identity today. The next time you hear American politicians invoke God's blessing on America or claim divine authority for American foreign policy, you'll understand that you're witnessing not ancient tradition, but Cold War innovation, the continuation of a strategic transformation that made Christianity central to American national identity in order to compete with godless communism. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep seeking to understand how the great power conflicts of the past continue to shape the religious and political identities of the present. This is Professor Archive, reminding you that the most important stories are often the ones that reveal how external pressures transform internal cultures in ways their participants never fully intended or understood.